The American comic book industry is an absolute disgrace. America, more than any other country, invented the comic book. And let me tell you an interesting fact. Back in the golden age of comics, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, the golden age was the original age of comics from the time they were invented straight through, from the 30s, let's say, straight through till the 50s. And then the Silver Age of comics really begins around 59 and is the 60s and part of the early 70s. And then some people talk about a Bronze Age of comics, but those are the basic ages of comics. Okay, so now that we've covered that, let me tell you something interesting. In the Golden Age of comics, a comic that sold less than 200,000 copies a month was considered a failure, and it was routinely canceled. Comics that sold less than 200,000 a month were canceled. They were considered failures. It was not unusual in the golden age of comics to have comics that were million sellers. Okay, Lev Gleason, how many people remember Gleason Publications? Lev Gleason had a hit comic that sold to adults called Crime Does Not Pay during the late 40s and the early 50s. It was a comic of true crime stories, and very downbeat, very unsensational in a superheroic sense. Didn't have big epic superheroic battles or superpowers or fantasy, or it wasn't romantic, it wasn't funny. It was very grim, downbeat stories which each ended with a person dying or going to the electric chair or going to jail. Now, Crime Does Not Pay sold 5 million copies a month. Let that sink in for a minute. This is a comic with no appeal to children, selling 5 million copies a month. Lev Gleason, at the peak of that comic's popularity, was only publishing 6 titles of comics. These are comic books. And yet Gleason's 6 titles at the time were selling more copies per month than Life, Look, Saturday Evening Post, Time, and Newsweek combined. Lev Gleason's titles were selling more than the popular slick paper magazines of that day. Okay, when Simon and Kirby brought out the first romance comic, which was called Young Romance in the 1950s, a romance comic, which basically only appealed to girls and women of a certain age, was selling 1 million copies a month. Okay, and that's a romance comic. Again, a comic with limited appeal, selling 1 million copies a month. Okay, so comics are totally capable of selling big numbers. They used to sell in big numbers, and that was without the benefit of any hit movies. That was without the benefit of TV shows. That was, without the internet. I thought somebody was going to hit somebody. That they used to sell huge numbers. They used to routinely cancel comics that sold under 200,000. Now come up to the modern day. I read recently where Marvel has a lot of comics, virtually their entire line, selling well under 100,000 copies a month. Well under. Okay, even their best-selling comics are well under 100,000 copies a month. Now, and some of their titles are well under 50,000 copies a month. Now, this is outrageous. This is an outrageous failure on the part of Marvel and the people running it, and DC is not doing much better. Comic book companies are no longer comic book companies. There's tiny little subsidiaries of great big multinational corporations whose primary businesses is not selling comics. And the editors of comic book companies today are basically doing the bidding of their bosses to maximize the profits in the moment, while, I don't know what to say, savaging, I would say, the entire line and the future of their business. And they've been doing it for quite a while, and they've been in a hole digging, and they keep digging that hole deeper, and they refuse to throw the shovel out and come up to the light of day and stop digging. They are ruining the comic book industry with the way they are approaching it. Think about what an epic failure this is for a moment before I get to the solution, and I do have a solution. But think about what an epic failure it is. This is a country, last time I read, of 320 million people. And that's just in America. Marvel doesn't just sell comics in America. But let's just look at America. 320 million people. Let's even round that down to make the math easier and say 300 million people. Okay, a million is 1,000,000. So if you sell a comic to one person out of 1,000, okay, that's 1/10 of 1%. If you sell a comic to one person out of 1,000 in America, even rounding the numbers down, that comic would be selling 300,000 copies a month. And that's only by reaching one person out of 1,000. Now, can someone explain to me why there's a hit Spider-Man movie that 1 million people go to the theater and pay $9 or $10 to see in the theater? You know, millions of people, not just a million, but millions of people go to see this movie. You have a movie that millions of people are going to see, and Spider-Man is selling less than 100,000. How is that even possible? Okay, less than 100,000 means you're only reaching one person out of every 3,000 people in America. How can you have a hit movie that 1 million people or more go to see, and then the comic book with the same character only sells a comic to 1 out of 3,000 people? That is an insane failure by any standard. In any business, that would be considered an unbelievable failure to connect with the audience. You have an audience that likes this character, and you're incapable of even reaching the level of selling to 1 out of 1,000 people, and you're part of a large corporation, so that if you had the money, if you had something that was actually selling, the corporation has the money to promote it. They have the distribution to be able to get you into stores. They have the muscle to put some marketing behind it. But they're not doing it. They're not really marketing you because your product is not worthy of being marketed. And no, more marketing is not the answer. And I'll tell you a couple other things that are not the answer. More gimmicks are not the answer. Putting out more titles of the same character of your best. This is what corporations do. Well, that character is selling well. Well, let's put him in 2 titles. Let's put him in 3 titles until the public is so sick of them that we have to cancel them all. No, that's not helping. Another epic event miniseries is not helping. Those things are not helping. You know, saturating the market like DC does, where they have 9 different Batman products coming out in a single month. The Batman miniseries, the graphic novel, his regular series, his limited series. It's ridiculous. Saturating the marketplace to exploit every last drop of a character's blood before you ultimately cancel him. That's not. Of course, Batman will never be canceled because they'll keep feeding off that corpse until there's nothing left of it. But that's not helping. None of these things are helping. What the comic book industry needs is to get the reading audience back. Now, Americans still read. It's not a matter of not reading. Look at the sales on romance novels. Okay, did you know that they publish more romance novels than all other categories of fiction combined? That's kind of an appalling statistic, I think, as someone who doesn't like romance novels, but it's absolutely true. The American public does read. We consume stuff on the internet constantly. We're reading things. And comics only require a very short attention span and are very visual if you do them right. If you do them right. The problem is they're doing them wrong. Now, before I get to the solution, let me just define the problem a little more specifically. What is wrong with comic books today that they can't even sell to 1 out of 1,000 people, or even really 1 out of 3,000 people? It's appalling that you have popular, well-known characters and you can't sell to more than that. So what is wrong with them? Why don't they appeal to the people who go to the movies? Well, number one, there's no entry point. There's no logical jumping in point to reading comics. They've created a completely oblique, impenetrable world for their hardcore fans that is completely inaccessible to people who are not hardcore fans. And what do I mean by that? Comics are riddled with continued stories. You never know when you buy a comic if you're buying the first part of a story, the second part, or the 5th part, or the 12th part of a story. You never know how long a story is going to last. You don't know how much time and effort you're going to have to devote to reading that story. You say, I'm going to start reading Spider-Man, and you pick up an issue and it's part 5 of 6. That's not satisfying. You read that issue and you never go back to read the final part because you don't know what's going on. And then when you see the advertising in that story, you realize, and the house ads, you realize that it's not just, if you had hung with the one title, you would eventually figure out what's going on, but it's not just one title. They want you to read every title. They want to connect them all together in big events, and they want to have them all tied and interlocked so you feel like if you're not reading everything that you're missing out. Well, who has time for that? Who has money for that? Do you have any idea how much money it would take to read a large, the entire Marvel lineup of titles in a month? It's extremely costly. And I know Marvel and DC have experimented with this thing of selling you a pass so you can read everything online. But people like to have something in their hands. And only a person who's already a hardcore fan is going to buy that kind of pass and want to read everything online. Okay, you have to already be a hardcore fan to think, I'm going to make a commitment to buy this every month and I'm going to read it online. Most of the things that are reading online don't require a commitment, don't require any financial commitment. So they've built a world with no entry point. So there's no entry point for the new reader, and that's a problem. Another problem is that the writing on comics is wildly self-indulgent. Okay, there's no reason for these mediocre stories to drag on for 3, 4, 5, 10 issues. Okay, if you have a special story, that's one thing. When I was growing up, I was born in the 60s. When I started reading comics, every story was complete. When you bought an issue of a comic, you were almost guaranteed that the story would begin and end in that issue. And sometimes there were more than one story in an issue. Superman maintained a format of having 2 or 3 complete stories per issue straight through most of the 60s. Okay. Spider-Man and all those characters that Marvel did, most of them did not have a continued story that was longer than 2 parts until the 70s, and they very rarely had continued stories at all in the 60s. Now they would have dangling subplots sometimes. You would have a series of stories about Spider-Man confronting Kingpin, for example, but they did not do continued stories as a routine thing. You need to give the reader who spent his money on the issue the satisfaction of reading a complete story. Okay, this is one of the major faults with comics today, is that they expect everyone to just buy into their product and wait patiently to get one part of the story and then patiently wait a month to get the next part of the story. Who wants to wait a month to get the next part of the story? I mean, the weekly news magazines like Time and Newsweek are on their last dregs. They're about to go out of business. They've collapsed because nobody wants week-old news. We live in the era of the 24-hour news cycle. People don't want to wait a month to get the second part of the story, then wait another month to get the third part of the story. Think about it. A 6-part story is spread out over half a year. Half a year. Nobody wants to do that. Okay? And also, we've constructed this bizarro world where buying comic books is actually the least economical way of reading comics. You actually spend more if you buy the comic and wait a month between each part than you spend if you buy the book when it's collected and get to read it all at once. So there's literally a double disadvantage to buying it in comic book format. And you spend more on the book than you spend if you buy the online and read everything that way. But we don't want to encourage people to read the online, because if you do it right, you make more profit selling them a comic. I believe you will in the long run, but it doesn't matter. Online, the point is, online comic book collection sales are ridiculously low across the board in all formats. Absurdly low, stupidly low. If you have hit movies with millions of people going to them, if millions of people tune into The Flash on CW and tune into Luke Cage on Netflix, then those millions of people should be buying your comic, unless you're a completely incompetent moron. Okay, unless you don't know what you're doing as an editor or a publisher. You should be able to get people to buy something that is the same character that millions of people are watching. So, problems. Problem number one is no clear entry point. The entire Marvel Universe looks like an oblique, impenetrable mass to people who aren't already fans. Okay, problem number two is it's not economical format. People feel like they're ripped off. Problem number three is waiting a month between parts of a story. Okay. Problem number four is not giving the reader a story for his money, only giving him a piece of a story, which is a real psychological problem to selling that. Now let's just briefly take a look at what actually works in comics. If you looked at Japan, and there was a book that came out many years ago called Manga, or Manga, depending on what part of the American country you live in. I don't believe, some people say one is right, the other is wrong. I don't believe either is right or wrong. It's a matter of, tomato. It's when you say it in English, there might be a right way to say it when you say it in Japanese. When you say it in English, it depends on what part of the country you're from. But let's just call it manga. And I'll tell you that there was a book called Manga, which came out at the very beginning of the manga revolution in American comics, when very few people were reading mangas. And it's a very, very good book, and you should probably read it. I'm telling you about the book because I'm going to reference a statistic from the book. That statistic may be out of date. But at the time that book was written, and this was 20 years ago, they talked about comic book readership in Japan. At that time, comic book readership in Japan was approximately 70% of adults. Think about that. 7 out of 10 adults in Japan were reading comics, and a higher percentage of children, virtually all children in Japan, were reading comics. Okay, that's success. That's success. Okay, this is the spine, the root, the base of the whole success of anime is not anime itself. It's the comic book readership of Japan that gets people interested in these characters in comic book format. And then that has created the whole empire and edifice of anime. It's created based on the popularity of these comic book characters. All right. How do they do it? How do the Japanese get 70% of adults to read their comics? Well, Shonen Jump, to use that as an example, is a typical Japanese comic. It comes out weekly. It is a large anthology. It has hundreds of pages. I don't know how many hundred, but it's very thick. I would say it was like a phone book, but of course no one knows what a phone book is these days. So I don't want to confuse you young people, but it's like a phone book. It's a very, very thick book. It has hundreds of pages, more than 200 pages, I believe. And it comes out weekly, and it's an anthology. And yes, the stories are continued, but there's 20, 30, possibly even 40 different features in a single issue. It is basically almost the entire line of the comic book publisher in a weekly magazine. You buy one magazine. Actually, it's not the entire line. I mean, they have more than one magazine. Shonen Jump is just one magazine. But you buy a weekly magazine. It gives you hundreds of pages. It gives you dozens of features. And most of the stories are continued, not all of them. But you only have to wait 1 week for the continuation. And you're getting such a variety of characters and you have so many stories going on that are interesting to read, and it's written skillfully so as to bring you up to date. When you miss an issue, the writing brings you right up to date. It's written in a very transparent and clear way to remind you of what the relevant facts are that you need to know to enjoy that episode. But that's a format that works. Okay, so let's just put that aside and say the weekly anthology format with a big magazine works. And that's a format that you can still do continued stories because it's only weekly and because people get hooked on it. Now, let's take a look at another thing that works. Over in the UK, most successful publisher in the UK since the 70s is currently Rebellion. They used to be published by a different I'm talking about the 2000 AD publisher. Now 2000 AD, the reason I said currently Rebellion is it used to be published by a different publisher, but it's currently published by Rebellion. But since the 70s, this publisher has been consistently atop in the British and UK sales, and really a big publisher in Europe, based on the fact that they have 2 magazines. They have only 2 magazines. They have 2000 AD, which is a weekly anthology, which is much thinner than Shonen Jump. It only has 5 features. Judge Dredd is the lead feature in every issue, but it's weekly, and the other 4 features rotate. They have a large cast of characters that they built up over the years, and they rotate new characters and old characters in and out the other 4 slots. But you are always assured that the lead slot will be their favorite character of Judge Dredd. Then their second magazine, that's the first magazine, the second magazine is the Judge Dredd magazine. Megazine, M-E-G-A, magazine. The Judge Dredd magazine is a monthly. It's also in an anthology format, and it also has Judge Dredd as the lead feature. If you read the 4 weekly 2000 ADs plus the Judge Dredd magazine, you've read it all. 1 large magazine and 4 weekly thin magazines. That's it. That's the entire publishing output. And they do continued stories, but they do them in a pithy enough way that quite often the Judge Dredd story, for example, might be finished in 2 or 3 episodes. So you get to the end of the complete story the same month you started it. And it's not unusual for stories in that magazine to do single issue stories. In fact, they have a series called Tharg's Future Shocks. Tharg is the editor, and Tharg's Future Shocks are short stories that are complete in 1 issue. So that's another format that works. It's a weekly format. It has continued stories, but you generally get to the end of the story in the same month that you started it. Okay, so you have that satisfaction level there. Now, I don't think that the American publishers can follow either one of these formats. I think, frankly, that they don't have the audience base at this point to start a weekly and make a success of it. There have been multiple efforts to start a weekly and to sell miniseries on a weekly basis, and they haven't really increased the audience. They're just selling comics to the same audience they have, that same shrinking, tiny, ever-diminishing, almost inconsequential at this point audience. So I don't think you can mimic either one of those formats exactly. But I think what we can do is we can learn a lesson from the golden age era of American comics as to what worked then. And I think, and let's just examine that for one moment. But we can learn a lesson from the golden age of comics as to what worked then, combine it with our knowledge of what works now, and come up with a format that can get us back on track to selling not 50,000 or 100,000, but 500,000 or 1 million books a month. Okay, that's the goal. Okay, now what worked in the golden age? Okay, let's not lose that thread. What did work in the golden age? Golden age comics were published in a 64-page format. 64 pages with multiple features, and the stories were complete. Continued stories were very rare. The lead feature might be a little longer, but most of the stories were on the low end of the scale, 5 or 6 pages, on up to the high end of the scale of being 12 or 15 pages. And very rarely would you find a golden age story, even if it was a lead feature, that was more than 15 pages. It just wasn't very common. It did happen. There were even some issues that were entirely devoted to one story, like the famous Human Torch versus Submariner fights that was published by the precursor of Marvel, Timely. But for the most part, Golden Age comics in America, 64-page format, multiple features, all complete stories. Now, can you tell a good story in 5 pages? Yes. But 5 pages is brutal. It's brutally short. But consider this, The Spirit by Will Eisner, which is considered one of the great classics of the Golden Age. It was actually done for the newspaper supplements and then reprinted into comics. But because it was done for newspaper supplements, they had to keep every story the exact same page count with an iron fist. They had no variation or flexibility. And so every single Spirit story is 7 pages long. And most of them have a big splash image on the first page. So most of them really only have effectively 6 pages of panel-to-panel continuity. And the spirit stories are masterpieces of that type of fiction. The spirit stories are classics of the Golden Age. I mean, they stand up against any other Golden Age story you care to point to, and they were only 7 pages long. Now, I have done comic book short stories for a long time. When I worked in the sex undergrounds for Fantagraphics, all the stories, all 16 of the short stories that I sold them were 5-page stories. And in many of my own publications, I've done 8-page stories. I find 8-page to be a very acceptable format. But it is definitely, I can tell you, I'm getting off the track here, but I can definitely tell you that 8 pages is plenty of space to tell a good story. But you don't need to go down to 8 pages. Okay, let's get to the solution that solves the problems. And here's step 1 of the solution. Okay, because I was getting a little off track, so let's bring it back in and talk about what the solution is. Step 1 for Marvel Comics would be to cancel everything. Okay, Marvel Comics needs to cancel their entire line. Number 1, it's the ultimate publicity move that wakes people up in the general part of America that doesn't read their comics and makes them pay attention. Something is happening here. It's the ultimate publicity move. All of their so-called events have had a diminished downward spiral of publicity. It's almost impossible for them to publicize an event as being a real event and getting fans excited about it. If they were actually going to cut off Spider-Man's left arm and leave it off permanently, they couldn't get fans interested in reading that story because nobody would believe that that anything significant was going to happen. There's no words you could use to convince people that there would be anything significant happening in the new Marvel event comic. So no matter what change you're going to make, I mean, if you're going to have the Thing marry Sue Richards and have Honeymoon on Mars, you can't get people to read it if they don't believe anything interesting is going to happen. And they've already burned their bridges to the point where nobody believes anything they say. So this is the first thing that would be good about canceling all their titles, is it would be the ultimate publicity move. It would be a moment when the actual news channels and the newspapers would all turn around and pay attention to you, and you would have that platform to speak to all of America for one moment. And you use that platform at the time when you're canceling titles to say, we've gone far off track. We have wonderful characters. We have talented writers. We have talented artists. But we have mismanaged our business to the point where no one wants to read our comics anymore. We need to take a break, step back, figure out who we are, and plot a new course into the future. So there will be no Marvel Comics this month or next month. We will and then you announce that we are going to begin reprinting our classic comics starting 2 or 3 months from when everything is canceled. Give the public a breathing space of 2 or 3 months where there's no Marvel product whatsoever. Then, after an appropriate breathing space, your first move is this. You pick 6 or 7 Silver Age comics, which is the comics that everybody loves the best. Okay, Spider-Man, Thor. You pick them based on what's popular in the movies. You know, Iron Man. And you repackage those. Now, in the case of Spider-Man, you don't need to do anything. In the case of Iron Man, he started out in in stories that were only half a book. So then you need to repackage that, and half the covers didn't really feature him. So you need to repackage that a little, putting 2 stories together, or perhaps just reprinting it with the original companion story, with the original covers. So you bring out a reprint line, a small reprint line. Now, you've already milked these stories every which way. You already own all the art and writing free and clear. You're not spending anything on these comics except printing and distribution costs. So what you do is you bring out this very limited line 2 or 3 months after you cancel everything of reprinting Silver Age classics in the comic book format. And you sell them hopefully for $1 each. That would be a good price. Because you could get people to buy that. People see that first issue or the first issue of Hulk or whatever it is for $1, and it contains a complete story, and it's a classic. And even though it's a reprint that all of us oldies have read in multiple formats already, there's a young audience out there that hasn't read it, that has seen movies and not read it. So that's step one, cancel. Step two is a small reprint line of what you already own at a low price. Okay, get the reprint line up and going. Leave it up and going for a couple months. Start putting house ads in it saying that you have something new coming out. When your something new finally comes out, here's what you come out with. Come out with a monthly magazine. You could call it Marvel Universe. You could call it anything, but Marvel Action. Okay, you put Marvel big in the title. Or you could even, if you figure Spider-Man is your most popular character, you could call it Spider-Man's Marvel Universe. Put it in like a 200-page format, big magazine format, so it can be sold in regular magazine racks, but it can also be sold at comic book stores. There's nothing to prevent them from shelving it. But you make it a big, slick paper magazine format, okay? And with advertising, but give the fans, give them about 200 pages of story. Now here's the significant thing. No continued stories, at least for the first year. And if you do a continued story, it's a 2-part story only. Once you break down this magazine into a longer lead feature and shorter backup features, you have at least 10 features in this magazine. At least 10. Okay. You make the first story about, I would say the thing to do would be to make the first story about 30 pages. And insist editorially that each story, each 30-page story, be worthy of 30 pages and actually be a complicated story with plot and with action and with big visuals. And you have 30 pages to do it. Now go do it. The other stories, all the backup stories, would be 8, 10, or 12 pages, and you could vary the page count. You want to break it down so it's not all the same features every month. I would want to split it about half and half. Okay, here's what I would want to do if I was designing this magazine. I give you a 30-page lead feature with Spider-Man, okay, and a popular artist. Then I'm going to split the rest. Let's say that there's 9 other features, or let's say there's 10 other features. I split the other 10 features down the middle and have half of them, 5 of them, be about classic Marvel characters. Thor, Hulk, Iron Man, all the characters that are popular in the movies. The other 5 spots would be devoted to new characters, which are creator-owned. And that's significant, because you can't build a publishing empire into the future with only the same characters being milked over and over and over again. And you're not going to get the best artists to come in and sell you their best characters on a work-for-hire basis. That's not the way the business works anymore. You want to get the artists who are unwilling to sell their characters to publish their best characters with you so that you can both make money off them together. So I would split these the other features. If there's 10 backup features in this magazine, I would have half of them be regular Marvel Universe characters, the most popular characters, and I would rotate which backup characters you would use. They wouldn't always be the same, but there would be certain characters that would be in there a lot. I would have the other 5